Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today we will be talking about a very interesting science fiction book I read recently. This is 1971's A Time of Changes by Robert Silverberg. Now let me go ahead and quickly tell you what this book is about before we dive in a little bit deeper, and do stick with me because the introduction to this one is a little bit longer than I would normally like to do, but I feel like this story kind of needs a good setting for you to have an idea of what goes on inside of this book. In the far future, Earth is a worn-out backwater, and humanity is spread across the galaxy on worlds that begin as colonies, but now feel like home, each with its own long history of 1,000 years or more, and each with its own unique culture. One of the strangest is Borthon, where the founding settlers established the Covenant, which teaches that the self is to be despised and forbids anyone to reveal its innermost thoughts or feelings to anybody. On Borthon, the filthiest obscenities imaginable are the words I and me. For the crime of self-bearing, apostates have always paid with exile or death, but after his eyes are opened by a visitor from Earth, Kendall Derval, Prince of Shalal, risk everything to teach his people the real meaning of being human. So now let's jump into some overall thoughts. And I do think that that very last sentence there of the introduction to this story, where he says he risks everything to teach people, or his people, the real meaning of being human, is a very powerful sentiment throughout this book, and something that I found very deeply interesting. There was something about that exploration of self, but it wasn't just one self, it was self and togetherness at the same time. And there are some really trippy scenes here. It almost felt like how some of those stereotypical depictions of like LSD and those kinds of drugs, where like you kind of meld in and see like a far future world and your third eye opens and all that. There are definitely some scenes in this book that feel like they draw on that. Now I have no idea if that's true, if I'm maybe expounding upon some things here, but I did find it very interesting that this book, kind of tackled that idea of like opening up and expressing more of yourself to somebody else than, you would mostly think is possible. I will say, with that being said, I'm not sure I understood everything that was going on here in some of these sections of the book. I would love to see some more information about this book where the author talks about that expression of self and that togetherness, because I feel like I'm just missing pieces of whatever kind of philosophy he is trying to get into the story. Now, it really does seem that it almost is like, I don't want to say like an Eastern Buddhist kind of cultural idea of like oneness and togetherness, but it almost feels like it's a little bit there. I don't know if I'm being influenced by some other things I have read recently that kind of have some of that ideology in it, but I did find it fascinating that being yourself was seen as such a horrible thing. It is very countercultural to what we have today in today's society. Being yourself, expressing who you are as an individual is something that, is seen as a positive, is seen as a good thing. And to see a book that pushes against that, even though this was written in the 1970s, but a book that is just so counter to that idea, it was a very fascinating thing to read. Now, while I like this book, I do think a lot of people will struggle with it. It is a book from the 1970s, so you do have some of those writing things that are like mixed in with writing of that time. I will also say, it being a 70s science fiction book, there are definitely some interesting portrayals of women, sex, and I mean, we spend way too much time hearing about how our main character's member is very large, and that comes up multiple times. And so there are some of those quirks from not early sci-fi writing, there's much earlier works than this, but when you think of like a stereotypical 1970s science fiction novel, you kind of get the vibe that there's going to be some strange sexual stuff going on, and that is definitely prevalent in here. There's definitely like a lot of male gaze and all that kind of thing, but if you can, overlook some of those things, I do think there is some really good theming and ideas that are presented in this book. So let's go ahead and dive a little bit deeper in here with writing / prose / structure of the story itself. And this is actually one of those rare instances where the prose and the actual writing of a book is very impactful to the reader. With that being said, it is because the word I, like mentioned earlier, I and me, are seen as obscenities. Like the impact of the word I and me in the story is monumentous. When a character expresses themselves as an individual, it has a lot of weight to it, and it's something that I noticed, and it really stood out to me multiple times in the story, where like you see the corruption of our main character, and I don't even know if I want to call it corruption. You see his beliefs changing, and he starts, they call it self-bearing, where you start referring to yourself as I and me and the individual. And there's so much weight behind it when it happens. I found it very, very powerful. Now, I will say that does take some time to get used to, because the way the characters talk is not like we would normally talk in any sense of the imagination. You know, we are so used to saying, well, I went to the store or something like that, and that is just not a normal thing that would happen in a lot of these cultures. And that lack of I just is one of the things that really did stick out to me throughout the story. I will also say this uses the trope of, you know, you are getting like journal entries or a journal entry, kind of the recanting of a tale to you after most of it has already happened. Now, personally, that is a trope that I really appreciate, and I know it doesn't work for everybody, but that is another part of the structure of the story that I really enjoyed. And so it just had this really interesting mix of prose and story structure that I just found to work really well. And like I said, you'll never realize the impact of such little words. Like, me and I are not like, you know, some grandiose vocabulary words, but they end up having so much meaning and impact in the story throughout that I don't know, it's one of those times I normally talk about prose as just like a neutral thing, and this is definitely like a positive to the story. It actually impacts the story itself, which is not always something I want, but in this one in particular instance, I think it was very interesting. Now let's go ahead and talk about plot, and I really feel like I need to mix plot and characters together because it is very much a character-driven plot of a story. So we have our main character who is exploring himself, and this happens in a lot of different ways, but we get to experience so much of the culture of this world and the journey that our character goes on. We start with him from when he's a very young person to the time he is old, and to see him change and explore new things, I just found it really fascinating. And he goes through a lot of hardships. He starts out as, you know, a septarch son, which is basically like a king or an emperor, and, you know, falls from grace because of multiple different things, but getting to see these layers of society and the covenant that they have, that is the rule that makes, you know, self-bearing so deplorable. And our character is also not the most likable person through some of the things that's going on. He ruins a lot of things. There are things that he does that are, you know, should be seen as appalling to his culture. I mean, this culture is fascinating. I'll have to put that in here with the story. There are some very interesting things. You have this concept of a bond brother and bond sister, which is like this weird way that they end up interconnecting basically all of society, because your bond brother is not going to be bond brother with your bond sister. It's like this weird interconnected community that they end up having, and there's all these weird restrictive rules around it, but these are basically going to be the people you're the most close with, and we just get to experience that with our main character. And by the end of the story, I felt very endeared to him. He's a very flawed character, like I said. He does bad things. He treats other characters in ways that they know, you know, he shouldn't. His actions have horrible consequences for characters, and yet I can't blame him for doing what he did, because he goes on this journey of enlightenment, I think is the really best way to say this. And he wants to share that enlightenment with others, or at least that's what he thinks he is doing. And it is just such a struggle of trying to change the culture that he has been raised in. It's a planet-wide culture that's been going on for thousands of years. And it is just, I don't know, it's very powerful to see him try to fight against it. And it's done from this place of care and want, but he doesn't realize like how detrimental it is to try to make these grandiose cultural changes. And to see him have to deal with those consequences are just amazing. And like I said, I don't know if this is a book that a lot of people will like. I really do think a lot of people will struggle with it, but if you are like me and you really find this idea of the exploration of self and oneness to be interesting, this is maybe a book you should give a try. And like I said, I don't think I understand everything that's going on here. This is one of those books, though, that is going to be in my brain for a long time. Just this idea of getting rid of a culture, getting rid of the idea of like the individual is just so foreign and interesting that I don't know. It's just one of those ones that is going to be stuck in my head for quite a while. But I think that is all I'm going to ramble on here today for A Time of Changes by Robert Silverberg. If you have read this book, I would love to hear your thoughts on it. I don't think there are many people out there who have, so I am very much interested in hearing it. I feel like there are definitely some themes that we could have a good discussion about. If you plan to read it after hearing this review, definitely let me know down below in the comments as well. And as always, have a good one.